Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Victor Valley College Performing Arts Center. We're very excited to be here this year. As you know, in the past, we've held this at the Hilton Garden Inn. This is a phenomenal campus and a phenomenal facility. Afterwards, if you have time, walk around the campus. It's absolutely gorgeous, and even though I've been coming here for 10 years, even I was shocked what this campus has to offer, especially the Performing Arts Center. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We have an incredible program today. Starting us off is U.S. Congressman Jay Obernolte, followed by Dan Spiegel. He is the Managing Director of Coldwell Banker Commercial Worldwide. He'll be giving us a national update on commercial real estate. Then we have the State of the High Desert Commercial Real Estate with Robert Basin, Jared Schindel, and myself. Following that, we're going to have a town, city manager, and county of San Bernardino economic panel. We're excited to welcome Doug Robertson, Rachel Molina, Jesse Flores, Willie Hopkins, unfortunately was ill this morning. The assistant city manager, Tony Camargo, is filling in, so we look forward to hearing from Tony. Derek Armstrong from the county of San Bernardino, economic development director. So we'll welcome everyone up right after the commercial real estate panel. Then also very exciting, we have two presenters from BNSF and Brightline, two small projects in the high desert you might have heard about. So they're going to go ahead, and I love BNSF, they just named it big. That's bold, I love it. Also, the train seems to be moving quicker, so we have Andrew Mack with Brightline and Lena Kent with BNSF. After that, we have Chris Lamoureux from Coldwell Banker Home Source, who's going to provide a housing update for the high desert, also San Bernardino County and the state of California. And then we're going to finish out today with Dr. Christopher Thornburg. If you have not heard Chris, he's phenomenal, a very energetic economist. And we asked for a slide deck to insert into our presentation last Thursday. I think he had to update it over the weekend. I don't know, maybe a couple banks, some issues going on. So very excited to hear what he has to say about the economy. So before we get started, I really want to thank our sponsors who make this possible. Our title sponsor today was Beacon Economics. Our event sponsor was the County of San Bernardino, 1st District Supervisor Paul Cook. Our community sponsor was Providence Health, St. Mary Medical Center. Our gold sponsors, ISU Armac Insurance, the City of Hesperia, and Coldwell Banker Home Source. Our silver sponsors today, City of Adelanto, the Town of Apple Valley, and Howard's. Actually, I also want to point out Howard's set the stage up for us. I'm really excited, especially for the City, Town, and San Bernardino panel. I put them between two ferns, so that should be interesting. I promise I won't grill them. The bronze sponsors today, PRMG, Paramount Residential Mortgage Group, the City of Victorville, Alaska USA Federal Credit Union, Loan Depot, CoStar and LoopNet, Touchstone Escrow, Southern California Logistics Airport, and Edward Jones, Nick Holmes. Big round of applause for our sponsors. So our first speaker today is truly an American success story. You have tech companies that start to have garages or a dorm room. And in this case, our Congressman Jay Obernolte started his video game company while attending Caltech. As the company expanded, he moved it up to Big Bear, California, where he got involved in local politics. And Jay, correct me if I have this wrong. This is from memory, and it is fading. He first ran for the airport board and then graduated to the city council and became mayor before serving in the state assembly. He was elected as our 23rd California District U.S. Congressman. When people ask me about Jay, I tell them he's wicked smart, but relatable. One of the words I love when you read about politics and, the news, there's a lot of things said about politicians, but one of the favorite terms that I've heard about Jay is pragmatic. And if there's one term that fits him well, it is pragmatic. He has represented our district well, and I want to introduce him to hear what's going on. Jay, please join us.
Wow, good morning, everyone. What a beautiful morning in the high desert. I got up this morning and I looked out over the horizon, and for a couple of weeks now we've had the big, thick storm clouds and the snow and the rain and the wind, and to look out and see the sun kind of makes me optimistic for our country. Maybe it's a metaphor that we're now emerging from this turbulent, stormy period. What do you think? Do you feel that way? Well, here's hoping. I just wanted to take a few minutes this morning and talk about some things that are very near to my heart about the direction that our country has been moving in over the last few years and the direction that I think we need to get moving in the next few years. If you want to look at a couple of pieces of data that really are symbolic of where we are as a country, I want to offer a couple things to you today. The first statistic is that there was a poll a couple of weeks ago done across America, and the question that was asked was, are you better off or worse off financially now than you were a year or 2 years ago? And this is kind of a benchmark to see where we're at as a country. 41% of Americans said that they are substantially worse off this year than they were last year. Only 16% said that they were better off this year than last year. And that is stunning because just 2 years ago, that same poll was conducted and 13% of people said that they were worse off. So over 3 times as many Americans say they're worse off this year than they were a year ago compared with just 2 years before now. That's pretty compelling. Second statistic is the Bureau of Labor Statistics just came out with their inflation and employment numbers for the month of February. And what they found is, for the 18th month in a row, real wages for Americans have been in decline. And in fact, in February, real wages increased by only half as much as inflation, which means that American workers only saw their paycheck grow by half as much as that needed just to keep up in pace with the increase in prices. So to me, that is truly alarming because it tells me that as a country, we are not on the path to prosperity. The one big reason for that right now is inflation. And I know that inflation has been talked about a lot. I know that it's front of mind for just about everyone in federal government. But we are, I believe, at an existential turning point as a country, and we have to decide whether or not we're going to get serious about the problems that are facing America and American workers. This current round of inflation is catalyzed by 2 things, economists tell us. First of all, the fact that we had this pandemic affected and constrained our supply chains, and then as we were emerging from the pandemic, the federal government dumped $3.5 trillion of excess federal spending into the economy in the name of stimulus. The problem with that is any economist will tell you that prices are dictated by supply and demand. If you have supply that is constrained by supply chains and you create a bunch of extra demand by dumping $3.5 trillion of excess federal spending into the economy, prices have to go up. And that is exactly what happened, unfortunately. And to give you an idea of how big that is, normally in a given year, the entire federal government will spend about $5.5 trillion. So to spend an extra $3.5 trillion, that's big. That kind of illustrates a larger problem we have, is that the federal government has been spending in deficit for the last almost 20 years. In fact, our deficit hit an all-time high last November. We took in less than half as much as we actually spent as a federal government. That's unusual, but it's never happened before in the history of our country. It's never been that high. As a result, we're having to borrow more money every year. That deficit spending is also, economists tell us, fueling this fire of inflation. So to begin to put our country on the path to recovery and economic prosperity, we absolutely must get inflation under control, and that means we absolutely must get our federal government and its deficit spending under control. And I just want to take a minute here and talk about the consequences of the failure to do that. Right now, our national debt is $31.4 trillion, trillion with a T. And I don't know about you, but I have a hard time visualizing how big $1 trillion is. So let me put it in a different context. If you take that number, 31.4 trillion, and you divide by the population of the United States, you get the per capita debt. In other words, the amount of debt that every American is responsible for, owes. That number right now is $94,000 for every American man, woman, and child. Every one of us. That's a staggering amount of money. And unfortunately, I'm sure as everyone in the room has known about, well, let me take a poll. How many people have heard that we've hit the debt ceiling? Yeah, there we go. Not a lot of people haven't heard about that. You'd have to really live under a rock and not have access to the internet or television to fail to hear about that. So that's the debt ceiling right now, $31.4 trillion. The reason why there is a debt ceiling is that the U.S. Constitution gives the United States Congress control over any debt that is secured by the full faith and credit of the United States. So that means anytime the United States government wants to borrow money, it has to have the permission of Congress to do so. That's what the Constitution says. So in the early days of our country, the Department of the Treasury would come to Congress every time they wanted to issue a federal bond, and Congress would have to approve it. As you can imagine, that got a little unwieldy, so in the early 1900s, a new system was adopted where a single unified debt limit was set, and the Department of the Treasury was authorized to issue debt up to that limit. So periodically we hit that limit, and that's what's happened earlier this year. So Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, tells us she is now relying on what she calls extraordinary measures to continue to spend in deficit. That's essentially robbing Peter to pay Paul. And she also tells us that her ability to do that is going to end in about June, she estimates. Now, the Congressional Budget Office, which are really the big brains in the room when it comes to budget numbers, they did their own math, and a couple of weeks ago they issued their projection, and they're a little bit more conservative. They say probably July to September, somewhere in that time frame. So we've got that long to try and figure out what to do about this problem. And to be clear, no one in the United States Congress believes that we shouldn't pay our bills. The metaphor I like to use is, imagine that you have a teenager, and I've raised two. I'll bet a lot of people in the room have raised teenagers. Raise your hand if you've had a teenage, if you have one or have raised one. Yeah, a lot of people. So you're going to identify with what I have to say. Imagine that you give your teenager a credit card, okay, because you want to teach them about money. But you set a limit on that credit card that's a lot lower than your limit, and you say, okay, this is the amount of money that you have to spend. And imagine that your teenager comes to you one day and says, Dad, I've hit my credit limit. So what do you do? I mean, first of all, it's very clear you are responsible for paying the money your teenager put on their credit card. Right? I mean, you were the one that authorized that. No one is talking about not paying the balance of the credit card. But as parents, I think it would be extremely irresponsible for us to just raise that limit again without having a discussion with your teenager about why there is a limit, why they're spending more than they're making, and the long-term consequences of failing to live within their budget. Wouldn't you agree? Okay, so that's essentially the situation we're in as a country, except, of course, the teenager is the United States government. So many of us in Congress feel that it would be irresponsible to raise the debt limit absent a serious discussion about how we got here and what we're going to do about it. Because, folks, if we fail to solve this problem, the consequences are dire. The Congressional Budget Office says that on the path that we're on right now, and that's if nothing else goes wrong, if nothing else goes wrong on the path we're on right now, in the next 30 years, our budget deficit will almost triple. Not in dollars, but in terms of a percentage of our economy. Right now, we're spending in deficit about 4% of GDP. The CBO estimates that if we do nothing, it'll be 11% of GDP by the year 2050. At that time, our per capita national debt, remember I told you right now it's $94,000, it will be over $350,000 for every American. When our national debt is that high, the thing that will be primarily driving the increase in the deficit in following years is just the requirement of paying interest on the debt we already have. In fact, 60% of the deficit increase will be driven just by paying that interest. And when the debt gets that big, the CBO says, in the mid-2040s, it will pass the total cost of Medicare. In the late 2040s, it will pass all discretionary spending combined, and by the late 2040s, it'll pass Social Security. In fact, by the year 2050, at the rate we're going, over half of all federal tax revenue will be required just to pay interest on the debt that we have. And that's if interest rates are as the CBO projects, which are lower than they are today. At today's interest rates, there wouldn't even be enough federal tax revenue to pay that interest. So the question is that acceptable? And I say, no, it is not. I mean, I feel like, as a parent, I feel like we have an obligation to our children to leave them a better world than the one that we inherited from our parents. And I fear that we are in danger of being the first generation of Americans who fail in that responsibility to our children. So we have an existential crisis coming. The sooner we deal with it, the easier it's going to be to deal with. Not that it's ever going to be easy, but it's much easier now than if we wait until 2040 and then deal with it. So that's the debate that we're having in Congress. Unfortunately, we're in a very unproductive place politically in our country. And I think you saw some of the politics being played if you watched the State of the Union address a couple of weeks ago, when discussion about this issue devolved into a disagreement about Medicare and Social Security. And I was very dismayed to see our president accuse those of us who are urging more fiscal responsibility to be in favor of cutting Medicare and Social Security. To me, that's a nonsensical statement, because Social Security and Medicare, those are trust fund programs. That means they're funded by their own revenue stream. They're walled off from the rest of the federal budget. They have their own problems, and I hope we solve them, because the CBO says that they're in structural deficit, both of those programs. But that has nothing to do with the problem that we're talking about right now. So what should we do? Well, I have a couple of ideas, and I think you're going to see a lot of ideas presented in the next several months. But in general, I think we need to put our country on a path towards balancing our federal budget in the next 10 years. And unfortunately, 10 years is about the minimum. If you look at the changes that would have to be made, anything less than 10 years is really a catastrophically large change for our economy to handle. When you're talking about an economy that this last year, 2022, was 25% of our GDP was federal spending. So when it's that high, making changes in federal spending and restructuring federal programs is something that you can't do quickly. So I think 10 years is about the minimum that we can get it done in. But I would like to see us on a path towards doing that, to making some meaningful federal reforms. The good news is we have been in this situation before. The last time that our federal deficit and our debt was this high was coming out of World War II. And as everyone knows, World War II was an existential crisis for our country. We spent in deficit to provide the means of winning the war that was threatening democracies all over the world. It was necessary to do that, but it was as we emerged from it, the U.S. Congress recognized the danger that that level of deficit spending had for the future prosperity of Americans. And so they instituted something called an Anti-Appropriations Committee. That was a committee that would go through, it was bipartisan, it would look at every single federal program, identifying programs that were no longer fulfilling their original purpose, programs that were inefficiently run, programs that needed to be scaled back. And they made those recommendations, and Congress acted on them. And over the next few years, they actually succeeded in balancing the budget. So I've got a piece of legislation called the Finding Federal Savings Commission that would do exactly that, that would impanel a bipartisan committee of members of Congress to make these recommendations. Those recommendations would be codified in the form of legislation that would come to the floor of the House, as we say in parliamentary language, highly privileged, which means they would not go through committee, they could not be amended, because that's a lot of the way that this kind of legislation gets watered down, and they would be forced to have an up or down vote in the House. And I think that that would be one good way of starting down the road to balancing the budget. But folks, we've got to do something. We've got to do something. So I want to close with actually some optimism, because I believe that America's best days are still ahead of it. I believe we can fulfill the commitment we made to our children to leave them a better world than the one that we were left with. And I believe if we start our country down the path of fiscal prudence, that these things are possible. But the way it will happen is first balancing our federal budget. That's the key thing. If we can do that, the good news is we can grow our way out of the rest of the debt. So say, for example, we succeed in, over the next 10 years, balancing our federal budget. That would stabilize our national debt at about 150% of our gross domestic product, which is still very high. But say over the next 20 years, our economy grows and doubles in size, which is not an unrealistic projection. That means that by the end of the CBO's period, instead of the national debt we were talking about a moment ago, our national debt would only be 75% of GDP. That's a much more manageable number. So we can solve this problem if we work together. I remain an American optimist. I think that we are on the cusp of some developments that are going to put us on an inflection point to the greatest increase in human prosperity that our society has ever seen. And I could give you my hour-long monologue on the subject, things like artificial intelligence, that are really, really going to explode the potential for prosperity, our standard of living, things like basic longevity, our ability to eradicate poverty. I'm really optimistic about those things, but folks, we have to solve this problem first. So I want to thank you very much for being involved on this issue. I want to thank you for attending the symposium, being involved, and I want to thank you very much for talking to you this morning. It is an honor to represent you in Washington.
Thank you, Jay.